Good morning, everyone. Ben says the greatest miracle at Soul Survivor was that they survived my cooking, but that's unkind. We're going to be starting this month, looking at Psalm 90, which is entitled A Prayer of Moses, the Man of God. Now, there are some people who question whether Moses wrote it. I can't see any reason why we shouldn't believe Moses wrote it. It fits in with the whole way that he thinks and speaks. And if Moses did write it, it makes it one of the oldest poems that there are in the world. And isn't it brilliant that the oldest poem we've got is focused on praising our Lord Jesus Christ and praising God the Father? Let's read the first bit of Psalm 90. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn men back to dust, saying, return to dust, O sons of men. For 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. You sweep men away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. Though in the morning it springs up new, by evening it is dried and withered. And then verse 10. The length of our days is 70 years, or 80 if we have the strength. Yet their span is but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass, and we fly away. We've entitled this, Living in the Light of Our Insignificance. We'll be looking at the other verses in the Psalms in other weeks. But are we insignificant? There are some people who think they're very important persons. And I thought of looking at some from 2011. Politicians think they're important. Well, in a sense they are, because we suffer for the mess that they make of everything, don't we? So, anybody tell me who this is? David Cameron, the Prime Minister. And just by way of political balance, Ed Miliband, the leader of the opposition. Heads of state, they tend to be around longer than politicians. Politicians come and go. Who is it? Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, who's been around a lot longer than any of the politicians currently causing havoc around the world. But not all heads of state are around forever. Barack Obama, President of the United States of America. This was taken before he was elected. I think if we took a photograph of him this week, he may not be quite as cheerful looking. If you think Stuart's had a bad fortnight, think of poor old Barack Obama. Sportsmen, they think they're significant. Well, he does anyway. Anybody tell me? Wayne Rooney plays for some team up in the northwest. Can't remember what it's called. For those who prefer a more leisurely, boring sort of game, KP. Oh, Kevin, sorry. What's it? Never mind. Like I said, it's a boring, insignificant sort of game. They all think they're important. We all think they're important. There's a lot of media attention given to people like that. But what if we go 100 years ago? 1911. Any ideas? It's not Lloyd George, it's Arthur Balfour, who was the Prime Minister in 1911. And, keep symmetry, that's Herbert Asquith, who was leader of the opposition. Which Edward? Edward the Seventh? Yep. Interesting, isn't it? We know the kings better than we know the prime ministers. Who's that? No. Remember, this is 1911, and there is symmetry with what went before. This is William Taft, who was President of the USA. Has anybody heard of William Taft? Like you, Brian, yes. There is one educated man in our midst. Any idea who that is? That is the England soccer team, 1912, who won the Olympic gold medal at the Stockholm Olympics in soccer. So, a prize to anybody who can name any one of them. The thing is that in 1911, they were as famous as that bunch from 2011 that we looked at. And none of us know who they are. It doesn't matter. The point is that they're not significant. The people we think are important, in 100 years' time, nobody will know them. If anybody shows a picture of David Cameron in 100 years' time, they'll go, who? There are some, 5 years. There are some people who do stand out. Some people who have more significance. And Moses is one of those. The guy who wrote this psalm. We've all heard of Moses. We all know about Moses. Moses was born into a family that was in slavery. The people of Israel had been slaves in Egypt for over 400 years. The Pharaoh of Egypt had said that all babies born to the Israelites had to be killed at birth. But Pharaoh's Moses' parents, it says in Hebrews, because of their faith, saw that he was a special baby and they hid him. When he got to 3 months old, they couldn't hide him any longer. He started making too much noise. And so they made a basket and they floated him on the Nile in the basket. He was found by Pharaoh's daughter, who took him and adopted him as her son, and then gave him back to his mother to nurse. Absolutely fantastic the way God works. And Moses grew up as an Egyptian prince. He went to the age of 40, and at the age of 40, Moses decided that he ought to throw in his lot with the people of Israel. He felt that God had prepared him to do something for the people of Israel, but he didn't pray about it. He just went and tried to do it with his own wisdom and his own strength. And he killed a man and he had to flee. And for the next 40 years, he lived in the desert as a shepherd. And then God called him. And Moses became the great leader who led the people of Israel out of slavery into freedom. And at the same time, wrote 5 books of the Bible and gave us the 10 Commandments. And it's kind of encouraging, isn't it? You may not have done much. Moses didn't even start till he was 80. He then went on till he was 120, and it says that he was as lively when he was 120 as he had been when he was a young man. Not many of those about. So why is it that Moses has this significance? Why is it that we know about Moses? Well, he got a lot of things going for him. He had power. He was the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And as a member of the Egyptian royal family, he had a lot of power. He had wealth. Hebrews tells us that he turned his back on the treasures of Egypt, but the treasures of Egypt were his. As a member of the royal family, all the wealth of Egypt was his. Remember, those who were at Soul Survivor, remember he looked at Joseph. And because of Joseph, Pharaoh owned all of the land of Egypt. Joseph managed to bring all of the land of Egypt under Pharaoh's control. They were filthy rich. He had education. Stephen tells us in Acts chapter 7 that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Now, they're still trying to work out how the Egyptians built the pyramids. Moses knew how to build pyramids because he was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He knew about astronomy. He was a good mathematician. because those were the things that the Egyptians knew. He knew about agriculture. He was a highly educated individual. And he had loads of talent. Again, Stephen tells us that he was powerful in speech and action. But then there were a lot of other princes of Egypt in Moses' day who had all those advantages as well. So why was it that we remember Moses, but we don't know anything about the other princes of Egypt? And what was significant about Moses, what made the difference with Moses, was his relationship with God. Now, Moses was brought up by his real mother. Although he was the son of Pharaoh's daughter, he was brought up by his real mother. And she must have taught him about the true God, because it says that Moses, by faith, turned his back on the treasures of Egypt. And he couldn't have had faith unless somebody had taught him. And it must have been his mother who taught him about the true God. But although Moses had some measure of faith for the first 80 years of his life, it wasn't until he really encountered God at the burning bush that his faith became the real center point of his life. And it's very, very easy for us to be like Moses. To have that faith because we've grown up with it. We've been taught the truth. We know the truth. But it doesn't really fire us up. It's just there. Yes, we are Christians, but it doesn't make a lot of difference to us. But at the burning bush, Moses encountered God. It says in Exodus chapter 3 that he turned aside to see the bush because it was on fire but did not burn up. There wasn't actually anything surprising in seeing a bush burning in the desert. Bushes in the Sinai desert catch fire because it's very hot. What surprised Moses was that this bush was burning. You could just imagine him. He's there with his sheep. He's sort of half dozing. He sees the bush burning. He dozes off a bit more. He looks up. It's still burning. But it's not burning away. And he said, I've got to go and see what this is about. And as he approaches, God speaks to him. And he finds three things. He learns three things about God at the burning bush. The first is that God is holy. As he approaches the bush, God says to him, Moses, take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. The starting point for us, if we are going to know the power of God in our lives, is to understand and to see the holiness of God. We have a tendency to take God for granted. All of us do. We kind of chatter up to the moment the service starts, and then we do the holy bit, and as soon as the service stops, we chatter again. And yet, God, the Holy One, is here in our midst. What is holiness? It's difficult to kind of get a picture of it. This morning I was sat in my study, which faces directly east, and there's trees in front of it. And as the sun came up, suddenly the sun came above the trees and the light just flooded in. And I couldn't actually look out of the window because of the light that floods in. That's what God's holiness is like. You shouldn't look into the sun, and you can't look into God's holiness. And we have got to realize that the God we are dealing with is a God of purity and light. And that's why we can't approach him. That's why in our own strength, by our own efforts, we can never come near to God, because he is too pure and too holy for us to do so. But we've got to realize that that's the God we're dealing with. And until we do see the holiness of God, we're never going to take him seriously. And therefore, we're never going to take sin seriously. And we're not going to realize just how much it is that God has done for us in bringing us to himself. But then he learned that God was self-existent. He says to God, who will I say sent me? Because God tells him to go back to the people of Israel. And God says, I am who I am. Always, eternally the same. He doesn't say, I am who I was, or I am who I will be, or I will be who I was. He says, I am who I am. You and I owe our lives to our parents and our grandparents and so on. The world owes its existence to God the Creator. God owes his existence to no one. God is self-existent. He is the only one who is self-existent. That's what makes him God. He is the source of everything, of all life, of all being, of all existence. He is the self-existent one. So we've got a God who's holy and a God who's self-existing, a massive God, and yet he's a listening God, because he says to Moses, I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out, and I'm concerned about their suffering. Do you ever think God doesn't hear your prayers? Do you think God doesn't answer your prayers? The Israelites have been praying for 400 years. And God says, I've heard, and I'm concerned. I'm interested, it's important to me. But my timing is different to your timing. And sometimes when we think God's not hearing us, it's his timing that's different from ours. He does hear our prayers. He is concerned about his people's suffering. And he will answer, but in his time and in his way. And then Moses goes back to Egypt, and Moses challenges Pharaoh. And we have the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt. Moses challenges Pharaoh. Pharaoh refuses to let the people go. Moses calls for God to send a plague. God sends a plague. Pharaoh says, oops, sorry, I will let the people go. But as soon as the plague stops, he says no again. So God sends another plague, and so it goes on. And Moses learned that God was powerful. There was nothing that could actually stand in the way of God. And then the last plague took place on Passover night, and all the firstborn of the people of Egypt died. But the people of Israel, they placed blood on the doorposts and on the lintel of the door. And as long as they stayed within the house where the blood had been placed, they were safe. Picture of our Lord Jesus Christ and what he did for us. As long as we are covered by the blood of Christ, we're safe. And so Moses knew that God is a protecting God. If we turn to him, if we come to him, he protects us. Following Passover night, the Egyptians couldn't get rid of the people of Israel quick enough. And they sent them on their way, and they set off marching, and they came to the banks of the Red Sea. No way forward. And then Pharaoh regretted again that he'd let them go, and he set off after them with his up-to-date army, the most modern, most powerful army in the whole of the Middle East. And as the Israelites are there on the shores of the Red Sea, they can hear in the distance the rumble of the chariots. Where do you go? What do you do? What does Moses say? He says, stand still and see what God is going to do, because God is here. No matter what sort of circumstance you find yourself in, there may not be any way forward for you. There may be trouble coming behind you. You can't see any way out of the bind. God says, stand still and see what I will do, because God is present wherever we are. And then the people, the Red Sea parts, the people cross, the Egyptians try to follow them, the Red Sea closes over them, and Pharaoh's army is destroyed completely. And the people march on till they come to Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai is special because that's where Moses learned that God is a God of relationship. He took the people to Mount Sinai so that he could make a covenant with them, an agreement with them. You will be my people, I will be your God. And Moses learned an even closer relationship. And this is one of the most mind-blowing verses in the Bible, I think. In Exodus 33, verse 11, it said, "The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend." Isn't that just a fantastic relationship with God? And that's why Moses stands out head and shoulders above other men. But it's that Moses who is so far above other people who, when he faces God, finds himself completely insignificant. And the whole point of Psalm 90 is Moses looking at this wonderful God that he knows, this God with whom he speaks face to face as a friend, and saying, God, you are so big that I just can't grasp who you are, what you are. And it's in the light of those two contrasting things, Moses, who can speak to God face to face as a friend, Moses, who sees God in the immensity of all his being, that Moses prays this prayer. And there are three things that form the basis of Moses' prayer. The first is that God is unchanging. The second, that humans are transient. And the third, that God is our dwelling place. God is unchanging. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Time for us is linear. It has a beginning, it has an end. We start at a certain point in time, we move through time, and we can look back at the past, and we know what's happened in the past, at least some of what's happened in the past. And some of our memories are a bit distorted. It's always very interesting if you get a group of people who've been in the same place and get them to talk about what actually happened. Our memory of the past is kind of patchy. The only bit of time that we've got any hold on is the present. The future is a complete mystery. Well, not a complete mystery. There is one thing we know is going to happen in the future. There is one thing we're absolutely certain about, and that is that Jesus is coming back again. And that we do know. When? How? Where? We don't know. We have a tendency to talk about eternity past and eternity future as if eternity started, then it broke off and we had time, and then when time finishes, eternity will start again. But eternity is not actually like that. Time is embedded in eternity. And for God, all of time is present at the same time. For God, there is no past and present and future. There's just an eternal present. And I think that's what Moses means when he says, for God, every day is like 1,000 years. He doesn't mean that as far as God's concerned, it's 2 days since Jesus walked on the earth. Some of us talk as if that was what it means. Because he also says, 1,000 years are like a watch in the night. That's 3 hours. So as far as God's concerned, 1,000 years, 1 day, 3 hours, they're all the same. They're all here and now. And don't try to understand it. It's difficult enough trying to understand time. When you start looking at, it's all Einstein's fault. Time was quite simple until Einstein came along. And then it turns out that time travels at different speeds. And you know that if you set off in a spaceship and you flew out for 40 years and then came at the speed of light, or nearly the speed of light, and then came back, you'd still be the age you were when you left, but everybody else would be 40 years older. Difficult. And when you try then to start understanding eternity, it's impossible. But that's not the point. What Moses is saying is God is so much bigger than us that any idea that we have that we can understand God is just wasting our time. Just accept it. If you've got an explanation, if you can explain God, then you haven't understood him at all. Human beings are transient. Life is short. Moses says, Where's it gone? Yes. The length of our days is 70 years, or 80 if we have the strength, yet their span is but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. It's interesting, actually. All the commentaries get terribly worried about this. The length of our days is 70 years. The average life expectancy, the world average life expectancy in 2011 is 69 years, which is as close to 70 as doesn't matter. We do better in Norfolk. In Norfolk, the average life expectancy of a man is 79. The average life expectancy of a woman is 82. It's not fair. The point is, whether it's 60 years, 70 years, 80 years, it's short in comparison to eternity. And death is inevitable. You turn men back to the dust, saying, "Return to dust, O sons of men." You sweep men away in the sleep of death. They are like new grass of the morning. Though in the morning it springs up new, by the evening it's dry and withered. God is infinite. We are negligible. And yet, God is our dwelling place. It's just complete paradox. The whole psalm is just complete paradox. God is infinitely greater than we can imagine, but he is interested in you and I. God is our dwelling place. We find our security in our home. We find comfort in our home. We find openness in our home. Home is where you can be yourself. You don't have to put on party manners at home. And we belong at home. And all of these things God is to us. How can we be sure? If God is so great, how can we be sure he's interested in us? Because he sent Jesus. And Jesus, God himself, came down to live among us and walked among us. And we can see what he was like. He cared for the children. He cared for the weak. He cared for the suffering. And he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He loved us so much that he died for us. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He loves us as much today as he did when he went to Calvary. He welcomes us as much today as he did 2,000 years ago. Our problem is that our picture of God is far too small. We have a great God, a wonderful God. We have the privilege of worshiping him and serving him. May each one of us begin to get some sort of sense of just what a wonderful God we serve. And let's sing a very well-known hymn, which expresses those thoughts much better than I can. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the works thy hand hath made.